Hello and welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast. Now, one of the tiny advantages of the C-19 pandemic is some incredibly busy, very influential people are suddenly a bit easier to get hold of. So today's guest is definitely one of those, an amazing man I have met a few times at energy conferences in London. Michael Liebreich, believe you me, is a force to be reckoned with, an extraordinary man. Michael founded New Energy Finance in 2004. In 2008, he sold the company to Bloomberg, and when it then became Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a very interesting publication. Since then, he's gone on to sit on the board of so many sustainable technology, clean transport and new energy startups and companies, it would take me half an hour just to list them. Oh, and he's got an MA with a first-class honours degree in engineering from Cambridge University. But you know, haven't we all? I mean, there are days when I think I've taken on too much, but my activities pale into insignificance with his schedule. But of course, not so much at the moment. So it was a golden opportunity to have a chat. So please welcome Michael Liebreich.
In 2004, I founded a business called New Energy Finance, and the thesis was that we were in the early stages of some really powerful long-term changes around, at the time it was just around energy, so the shift to renewable energy, the growth of wind and solar, although we did biofuels and all sorts of things, and then that got drawn into the smart grid, storage, transport and so on. The business really flourished. I mean, I hit the timing absolutely spot on, grew it very rapidly 2004 to 2009, and sold it to Bloomberg. So that's Michael Bloomberg's business. Yeah. And it's now Bloomberg NEF. So I founded it as New Energy Finance, and then it became Bloomberg NEF. And that's what it's been for the last 10 years. So I ran it for a while, and then I was kind of an executive chair, and now I do some writing for them. So four times a year I still write. But then I do lots of other things. I do some angel investing, so investing in startups. I do a bunch of advisory work, both for-profit and not-for-profit. I'm on all sorts of sort of great and good advisory boards for various things. Yeah.
That's great. But I mean, I think that is what is intriguing now is the prescience you had at that point that because this is our 10th anniversary of Fully Charged. It's been going for 10 years. And people are now saying to me, how did you know that electric vehicles would become more popular or grow or, you know, the simple truth is I hadn't got a clue. I just didn't know. I knew nothing. I was making it up as I was going along. I felt hopeful that it would. That's as positive as I could be. But
I think we should pretend that we had fantastic foresight rather than admitting that there was an enormous amount of luck involved.
Yeah.
I did understand a few things. Go back to 2004.
Yeah.
I was actually, the reason I had the leisure to think about these things was that I had been very involved in the dot-com boom bust period, which had turned out, I mean, I'd made a fortune on paper, and then I lost it all, also on paper, much of which I expected to lose, so that wasn't so painful. But I was left with just sort of no idea what to do next. And I was thinking about all of this, what should I do with my career, but also what was going on in the world. And it was just obvious that something in energy had to change because, you know, you had the Second Gulf War, which was an energy war. You had these power cuts in Europe, power cuts in America because of aging infrastructure, you know, the New England power cut and the big European power cuts. You had countries that were doing rolling blackouts like Brazil because their economy was growing so fast, but they couldn't meet the energy demand. And then you had pollution, local pollution, air quality, and you had climate change, which at the time I sort of thought, come on, it can't be that bad, can it? But it was still clearly a thing. And on the other side, you had these technologies which were very early stage, but clearly were just going to get cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah.
And that was all I knew, is they will get cheaper and cheaper, they will grow, and I need to do something, having kind of, been blown out by the whole dot-com thing. I needed to start again, build something, and that's how I dived in. So It wasn't like I knew that we'd be where we are today, but I was sure that there was going to be a ton more renewable energy in the mix. That I was sure about. That was all I was sure about. I want to say a ton more, 15% of electricity would go renewable. Something like that is what I thought.
Right.
Of course, now we know it's completely transformational. It's transformed the grid. It's transforming transport, electric vehicles. The whole thing really came after that.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, because I was very aware of that from my very early youth. I lived in a proper hippie commune in the 1970s but I was very lucky that it was mad as anything. And what I'm very grateful for is I didn't produce any children. There were a lot of children being produced and no one seemed to be that clear as who the parents were.
I hope you practiced at least.
In my mind and other places I practiced. I was quite young and I'm very grateful. But two of the people that lived in that house were postgraduate engineers from Oxford University, proper bright people who knew how to make things work. And we built a wind turbine, I think it was probably 1973, a wooden tower. I mean, it was crude as anything, super crude, recycled nonsense, very scrap heap challenge-ish in many terms. And it was a dynamo from a truck and bin lids for we hammered out to make the sails for the wind turbine. It had 4 sails, incredibly noisy, incredibly inefficient, but it did work. And because this house we were in was a very old farmhouse, no electricity, no running water. It had a well, and of course we thought that was great for a few months. But that definitely stayed with me. I then had nothing to do with renewable energy or anything to do with it at all for, I don't know what, 25, 30, maybe more years. But I've since discovered that one of those guys who I had lost touch with in 1974, I haven't seen him once, was was very high up in engineering at Danish Oil and Natural, at Dong, now Ørsted. One of their head engineers on wind. So he went from making a rubbish wind turbine on a Welsh hillside to making massive things out at sea, which he's now retired, and I'm trying to get in touch with him because it's such an extraordinary story.
Steve Jobs says you can only join the dots looking backwards in your career.
It's so difficult.
And when I was at Cambridge, not quite the 70s, early 80s,
right,
and there was something called Salter's Duck, and we looked at wind turbines. Yeah. I did some of the aerodynamics, some of the stuff I did in wind tunnels at Cambridge was related to wind turbines. There was a tidal barrage system that we looked at called in a place in France called La Rance. And I just found the kind of Cambridge, it was like a worksheet on, calculating the energy output and so on. And in no way did I think at that time that I would be, and of course I left engineering. I went off and became a management consultant, some kind of weird ski bum thing, brought it all together, did .com stuff, did venture capital, ended up doing what I'm doing, which is so close to the engineering that I did. And of course I'm using my thermodynamics mainly to kind of, poke fun at people who invent perpetual motion machines. But also things like, looking at energy efficiency. I'm drawing on my thermodynamics from back at Cambridge. I never thought would be useful in my career. But looking backwards, I even when I was a management consultant, I was with McKinsey, and I did some work on the German cheese industry. And I thought, this is a complete arabesque. This has got nothing to do with anything that I'm doing. It's really interesting. Do you know what? Cheese is bioprocessing. It's all about your bacterial transformations. It's about fungi. It's about producing a standardized high quality output from a biological input. It's exactly the same issues as biofuels, and we're going to get into synthetic fuels and so on. So even the stuff that I learned in the German cheese industry actually is of use as I think about what might the energy system and the bioplastics or the this, that, and the other in the future look like. It's incredible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the other thing that you mentioned in the most recent article, which I just thought was fascinating, is it's an area that I think was what kind of got me into it. I did a TV series called How Do They Do It? And 2 days I spent at I can never remember the name of it. It was a massive oil refinery in Pembrokeshire, West Pembrokeshire. So right out on that peninsula. Amazing engineers, incredible people running it. And it is vast. And it's one of the 3 big refineries we have. And that was just like, how do you refine oil? That was what I had to stand on top of a massive oil tank and go, how do they refine oil? Let's find out. Welcome to, how do they do it? Whatever it was. And it was just because you don't know. We don't know. And I think it wasn't so much my interest in it wasn't so much a criticism of the oil industry or, we shouldn't be burning oil or anything. It was, we don't know. The 99% of the population of this country who drive cars, who buy petrol, who buy diesel, have no clue how it gets there, how that stuff works. And that was that really kind of gripped me. It was how the bigger energy infrastructure that we're all incredibly dependent on operates, really. And it's kind of hidden for the large part from us.
It is. And I think it's a really serious issue because, people now, we've got this kind of immediate situation, very urgent, the health crisis, the COVID crisis, which I think we're going to need to talk about. But if you go back to the climate crisis, which until recently was the biggest crisis in the foreground for a lot of people, there's so many people who are really, want urgent, rapid action, but they don't actually understand what that means. So you'll get people like Extinction Rebellion who are good people and they really have their heart in the right place, but they'll say things like, well, we need to go, net zero by 2025. Well, excuse me, where does fertilizer come from in that world? Fertilizer is made from natural gas, right? And where do you get, how do you drive a tractor if you don't use diesel? Because there are no electric tractors, zero models of electric tractors to buy today. How do you get the food from the field, from the farm, into the cities? Because, of course, you still want to live in cities, I assume, even if you do subscribe to Extinction Rebellion. And so when you look at that, that's just 5 years' time to dramatically transform, farms, fertilizer industry, and food distribution. And I don't even want to say they haven't thought it through, because, of course, they haven't. None of us have. None of us really have. No. The transformations required are so immense, and they are so non-transparent to us. They're just, we switch the light and the light goes on, and we eat food. We don't think about what has gone into it. So we've got a long way to go. I mean, personally, I think that 2050 is a fantastic target for all of that. Well, not target, it's a fantastic goal and an imperative. But that's only 30 years. That's only one asset life cycle for a lot of the stuff, the big stuff around the infrastructure, maybe 2 or 3 asset life cycles for things like tractors and trucks and refrigerators and so on. So, we've got to get on with it. But people need to understand and one of the interesting things about renewables, and I think also about electric vehicles, is that once you start to use them and you just engage much more in those questions. You've got to educate yourself much more. If you've got solar panels, you'll be thinking, well, why do they only cover, 5% of my energy demand, or 10 or 20%? What the hell am I using? What is it? And then you'll be like, oh, look, it's the freezer, or it's the whatever it is. You start to learn. And what we've seen, there's study after study, that when people start to use distributed renewables, then they really start to work on energy efficiency. And I suspect that when people drive electric cars, they become much more aware of how heavy their foot is, or the geography and where they're going to go and where they're doing. So, it just makes people engage in a different way and much more actively.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I've always said about electric. The first time I drove an electric car, which was a long time ago in America, it was just, I was almost like cynical. I was going, why bother? It's not that, it's just a car. But what I then realized later is that, I opened that car door and my entire global, picture of the world shifted enormously. Where I then came back here, I had a very powerful petrol car that used a load of fuel, and I was going, I just sat and go, this is stupid. This is so inefficient. This is wasting really, really valuable resource. That was the thing that really annoyed me, was how as I understood efficiencies of machines, which is a thing that we talked about a lot, all the engineers behind the scenes on things like scrap heap, were really brilliant at that, and would explain, look, an electric motor is effectively about 90% efficient. About 90% of the energy that goes into it turns into, motive force, whereas 25% in an internal combustion engine, I mean, it's tragic. And that stuck with me, that side of it.
Yeah, so I just recently did a piece of work where I looked at the sort of how much work you can get done, how much stuff you can get done if you find offshore oil versus building an offshore wind farm.
Wow.
And on the surface of it, because if you just look at the kind of joules of energy, then there's lots more energy comes out of the offshore oil, and so you think, well, that's the one I want to do. That's the thing. The problem is if you say, well, actually, what I'm trying to do, the work I'm trying to do is actually drive around. I'm trying to use this oil, not, it changes if you do petrochemicals and so on.
Yeah.
But if you're doing driving around, and you suddenly realize that, okay, the oil that you find offshore, you're going, by the time you've got extraction, refining, getting it to the car, and then burning it, and then losing all the heat and all the noise and all of this, and you're using about 15% of it.
Right.
Whereas with the electricity from the offshore wind farm, you're using something like 85%, because you've also got regenerative, but you've got the motor and and the cycle and so on. But you lose something in the battery and then discharging but then you get regenerative braking.
Yeah.
But by the time you've done all that, you're about 85% efficient, and suddenly the wind farm looks like quite a good use of energy.
Yeah. Yes.
It's surprisingly. But just going back to what you said about when you got out of the car, you thought, this is so inefficient. There was a lovely piece of research. It was about 3 or 4 years ago when people bought electric cars. And they said, why did you buy them? And the number one reason is, well, they're more efficient and it's better for the climate and so on. And then a bit later, they said, would you recommend the car that you've bought to your friends and neighbors? And 95% said yes. They said, why? And the answer was not, because it's good for the climate. It's because it's a better car.
Right. Yes.
Because it's fun, because it accelerates like stink, because it's smooth, because it's not tiring to drive. Talk to London taxi drivers who are in the electric taxis.
Amazing.
And not one of them will give it back. Not one. And the reason they say is, at the end of the day, they're not tired because the thing doesn't rattle.
Yeah.
And they're not being vibrated in their seats for 8 hours, 10 hours.
Boiling hot. I've driven one in the summer in London, an old diesel taxi. I was covered in sweat when I got out of it because it's so hot. Yeah. No, I had the windows open and everything. I mean, very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, and that stuff's tough to analyze. I mean, that's true. By the way, the fact that it's just a better vehicle to drive is very difficult to capture in my spreadsheets.
Yes.
And similarly, in a home, when you do home efficiency, I've got a very advanced energy efficient home in London, and it's just more comfortable.
Yeah.
There just aren't the drafts. There isn't the damp. There aren't the sort of humming of ventilation fans and equipment and so on. It's just a better house.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Better house, better cars. That's why people are going to have them.
I think I do think you're right on that. And it is that I think it is, it's pretty obvious once the economics kick in. So when you look at how much it costs to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity, and you look at the various ways you can do that, and you look and you see that wind and solar are the cheapest, you go, well, why aren't we doing that? Then the arguments are totally different. Certainly in my heyday in the 1970s, you had to be an insane hippie, and we were insane hippies to build a bloody wind turbine. What's the point? Because we could just plug into the national grid and we burnt loads of coal. You imagine what the percentage of coal burning in 1972 would have been mind-boggling. It was during the miners' strike. And it brought the country to its knees. So clearly, we were hugely reliant on it.
It was before the nuclear build as well.
Yes,
some of them had come online, but in the early 70s there wasn't much nuclear either.
No, it's very little. Yeah, so it was a very different time. But
no natural gas. It would have been almost all coal.
It was vast. I would say it was 95% coal is what we were powered by. Yeah. But the other thing I think that is interesting that is another reason for it, which you mentioned in that, and it's an area that which I'm meant to lead on to from my talking about being in the oil refinery, but it's the oil price, and it's how the oil price works. Because I read that bit in your article with great relish to try and understand that. it makes no sense to me now that there's a reduction in demand that you drop the price. You'd think the price would go up. I don't know. No, clearly I don't understand economics.
So just a minute, when you say my article, I think let's clarify, which one are you talking about? Is just
That's the most recent one, the COVID-19.
So the one on COVID, okay. Yeah. And I assume you're going to put some links to the people.
Yes, I will. Absolutely,
yeah. What I did in that piece was, when I started writing it, which was very recently, it just struck me that a lot of the mainstream economists had simply not understood how serious the COVID situation was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're talking about 19th of March, the OECD was still saying that their estimate for the global economy was growth of 2.4% instead of 2.9%. And I was sitting there going, what? No, come on, this is really... And the big banks were still saying similar things. So that was when I started writing. So the first thing I did in that piece was say, look, this is really serious. This is going to go. It's not going to be over. If you think it's going to be over in 2 months...
I love that quote.
I got some luxury cruise tickets to sell you because it's not going to be over in 2 months. So I did that. And I then said, okay, not only is it going to be really crushing economically, and potentially, by the way, I think we're about to see some really unfortunate things happening in the developing world, which has been slower for the COVID to take off, partly probably because they don't test as much. But, you know, when you see these scenes in India of people going to the bus stations and trying to get back to their villages, and you think, oh, you know, it only takes 1 in 1,000, 1 in 5,000 to be infected, and this is a catastrophe in the making. So it's going to be very, very unfortunate, very tragic, and it's going to be extended for quite a while, even though a lot of countries will get it under control, like South Korea, will get there, but it's going to be very difficult economically. But it's happening at the same time as this oil price war.
Yeah.
And so I talked about that. I went on to do, you know, lots of stuff about how wonderful all these behaviors, working from home, podcasts are going to help in the long term. But the oil price war, I think that Saudi Arabia has made an absolutely classic mistake. I think that they've thought they want to knock out some capacity from the supply side. And specifically, it's the US shale oil, the unconventional oil, which has come on in the last 5-7 years, and it's vulnerable because it's higher cost than Saudi, it's higher cost probably than most of Russia. There's also things like the oil sands in Canada, and they just thought, right, we'll do a short, sharp shock. Maybe they thought we'll time it with the COVID crisis, so it'll make our work easier because it'll push down the prices even further. And then when they're all out of business, then we'll harvest, we'll push the prices up and we'll make lots of money. The problem is that the COVID situation is much more dramatic and much deeper. And what's going to happen to all of this unconventional oil capacity in the US is, now the companies might go bankrupt, but the assets, they'll still exist. They'll just end up doing pass the parcel, end up being owned by somebody else. And as soon as the oil price comes back up, then they're going to start producing again.
Yeah.
And, Saudi Arabia only has the ability in its foreign reserves to last for about 2 years at these oil prices.
Right.
2 years, we could easily see low oil for maybe not $20, but they can only last anything under about $30, $40. It's a couple of years, 2.5 years.
Right.
And people say, oh, but Saudi Arabia, they can get their oil out at these very low costs, $2, $3, $4, $9. Surely they are the last. They're going to be the last man standing, the last producer standing. But the way I look at it, Saudi Arabia, Aramco might be able to be profitable at $20, but Saudi Arabia, whose whole economy is so dependent on oil and petrochemicals, as a whole, because they're carrying such an inefficient economy, they need an $80 oil price.
Right.
And so if you think of Saudi Arabia as one big inefficient oil producer that needs $80, and if they think that they're going to get back to $80 by a short, sharp price war, and then get back up to an area where they can fund their entire, not just their economy, but also all of the unproductive people in their, population and their lifestyle as well. I think they're making a huge mistake, and I think they'll be. They did it in 2014-15. It's exactly the same outcome. In the end, they had to sort of sue for peace. I think that's what's going to happen.
Right.
In terms of the transition, how it plays out, I mean, obviously, low oil prices takes off it reduces one of the incentives to go to an electric car.
Sure. Yeah.
So it is going to reduce the speed of rollout of electric vehicles. We don't know what's going to happen with any stimulus. Governments might say, "Oh, we're going to stimulate the economy by accelerating the shift to electrics."
Yeah.
It's possible, but we don't know that yet. But in places like the US, cheap oil means almost immediately cheap gasoline.
Yeah.
And therefore, forget the EVs for the moment.
Yeah.
And it is going to have that effect. For some number of years, 2, 3, 4 years, this will slow down the shift to electric cars in, the US certainly, and most likely around the world in countries that are, certainly in the developing world. They're going to do whatever's cheapest, most efficient. And oil just became cheap, and they've already got the vehicles, they've got the distribution system. They'll probably stick with it more than they otherwise would have. But in the end, we're going to end up at the same place as you and I always thought.
Right.
It's not going to change the destination. No. It's a speed bump in some parts of the world, COVID will pass.
Yeah.
And there might be some stimulus programs or whatever. Who knows? The Trump administration may pass, depending on what happens in November. And we'll get back to these very rapid uptakes of EVs around the world.
But I mean, and also, do you see that in terms of renewables? Because presumably the investment, because that was one of the things we were planning to do this year, is to go out into the North Sea with one of the big installation ships that's putting in the massive turbines. Presumably the investment to do that in the first place is huge. Is that going to dry up? Is that going to, because they can't do it at the moment? Presumably they're not doing. I'm assuming they're not working now.
Well, right now, it's very difficult. I mean, you're in the middle of a lockdown.
Yeah.
So there are some deals going ahead. I've heard total extremes. I've heard some people say, "Gosh, you'd be surprised." In my business, nothing has changed.
Right.
We're doing virtual signatures and we're going ahead. And then other people say, "Oh, no, you can't get the bankers in the room with the lawyers and nothing's happening and nobody knows what's going on." Right. So it's a mess at the moment.
Yeah.
But don't forget that renewables, first of all, they are the cheapest source of electricity.
Yeah.
So anywhere where you have growing demand, once we've come out of the COVID situation, or where there's retirement of existing old aging power plants, renewables is going to win on its merits, as long as the grid can cope with the renewables, as long as there's some flexibility and so on, then renewables are a no-brainer. Where you have to build in flexibility, it's a bit more complicated, but not that much. And renewables are mainly about upfront costs. Right? You don't have fuel costs, and you have much lower maintenance. There's no thermal processes, no hot gases, none of that kind of. So you've got maintenance, but it's pretty small. Most of the cost is upfront, which means they're very, very sensitive to interest rates.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
A low interest rate makes wind much more competitive relative to gas or coal. Nuclear actually also benefits from low interest rates. Nuclear's got its own, massive cost problems. But if we look at this situation, we are almost a bit like after the financial crisis, 2008, and then the second round in 2011. We're going to be seeing pretty much a decade of low interest rates, right? Because of COVID. We're going to have these huge debt burdens. Everybody, you, me. Yeah. Countries, companies, everybody's got debt. The government will be keeping the taps open. We're going to see quantitative easing, prolonged. It's absolutely clear. Low interest rates. And, that's to the benefit of renewables versus, technologies with fuel costs. So, we're going to see lots and lots of bumping around and mess, but there's absolutely nothing. As long as there is energy demand, then you're going to see the renewables now. They're over the hump. You see a lot of countries where they're now up to sort of 15, 20, 25, 30% of electricity. I don't see anything fundamentally that would stop them going to 60, 70, 80%. The last 10 definitely gets difficult. The last 20, because then you start to say, what happens if there is no wind for 3 weeks?
Yeah. Yes.
And then you've probably not got enough supply in the system of flexible resource and so on. But I really see it, I really see the kind of the momentum, the costs, the low interest rates, an enormous tailwinds for renewables, absolutely. And of course, that has knock on for the electric vehicle side of things, because one of the things that we've been seeing in the last year, just changing, sort of shifting to slightly different. We've seen all of these, pseudo experts say, "Oh, electric vehicles are much worse. They're much worse for the climate than diesels." It's utter and complete. I don't know. Are we after the watershed when people are watching this? Can I use the word?
I think you can. If we beep it out, that's all we'll have to do.
Well, the Lib Dems said to Brexit, so I'm going to say that those mean. I think that normalises the word. I'm going to say the fact is that today there's I don't think there's a market in the world, an electricity market in the world, where the EVs are worse for the climate, even if there's loads of coal in the system.
Yeah.
And obviously in the best systems, Norway, Iceland, it's fantastically better. Not perfect. There's still a footprint, but it's much better. And then as the renewables do penetrate through from the sort of 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%, or nuclear, if somebody wants to do that. I say that for the nuclear diehards, that's fine too. The electricity mix gets cleaner and cleaner, both powering the car and powering things like battery production and battery recycling and so on. And so I think, we're safe. It's safe to say that the renewables kind of bow wave is going to do a little bit of, you can surf a little bit there on the EV side of things.
Right. Because also it's a fascinating comment that someone we interviewed last year mentioned, was that he kept saying, look, no one's worried about the first megawatt hour. That's easy. That's renewables. It's the last megawatt hour that is as in, here's, you need, I don't know, 600 gigawatts to run the country. Oh no, 60 gigawatts, on a cold winter's day for the whole country. I think our
peak is lower, but yes,
something like that. You're right.
The thing that so the one that I tell people to worry about is the beast from the east, right? Because that's when you've got an enormous spike of demand, driven a lot of it by heating. People say, we'll just electrify all the heating. Well, heating demand in the UK, if you just take the number of joules that we use for heating and the number of joules that come through the electricity grid, it's the peak is 5 or 6 to 1. So if they just say, we're going to just take every single boiler out and just put in an immersion heater, then you'd say, fine. Then you're talking about building six times the generating capacity, 6 times the transmission capacity, 6 times the distribution grid, and 6 times the size of the electrical switch box and everything in all of the fuse box in your house and so on. So that's not going to happen. We're going to do lots of efficiency. We're going to do heat pumps. We're going to use a mix of electricity and other things and so on. But you do worry about the time when the wind drops for a few weeks. Because batteries are fantastic, wonderful, beautiful things. They're getting a lot better. There's some very interesting things, by the way, with the million-mile vehicle that's going to happen, right? Yeah. But the battery won't get you through 3 weeks when the North Sea just says, that's it, we're in a winter high and there's no wind, and I'm very sorry if you're cold and if you want to watch TV or if you want to check or you want to watch Fully Charged, because you can't. Yeah. So, and at that point you've got interconnections, you've got you're going to have some sort of storage, but for those 3 weeks, you've got to do some kind of molecular storage, natural gas, hydrogen, ammonia, and or interconnections. I mean, I've got a mate who's looking into bringing in solar power from North Africa with a cable that will go all the way around Spain.
Oh wow! It doesn't go through Spain. We're leaving Spain out.
No, we're just. I don't think it's not just Spain. It's also France. You want to leave France out, I think, for some reason. I don't know why. I don't know. But the point is, it's directly purchasing very cheap solar from North Africa, which is. And to put it in perspective, there's solar power in Morocco. The world record price for cheap electricity
it's amazing, isn't it?
Is about 1.7 US cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, just to put it in perspective, when we buy in our homes, you and I buy electricity from whoever, the utility in the UK, it's probably about 15p per kilowatt hour. Yeah. The wholesale price might be 4 or 5p, and then you're getting solar power in North Africa for 1p already.
Yes.
Already today, it's like, I don't know, maybe it's 1.2 or 1.4, and it's going to
in
get
that
cheaper.
region. Yeah, yeah.
So if we can bring that round, either through the European grid, frankly, through Spain, through France, or coming in from, we're going to have to connect in all directions, because what we can't have is one cable. And if something happens, your substation goes bang in wherever, and then suddenly the whole country's lights go out, and no. So we've got to have lots of connections, but we do need to think through the resilience. Another thing that COVID is teaching us is resilience kind of matters when it matters.
Yes.
Doesn't matter the rest of the time, but when it does, oh boy, it really does.
Really
and so. We're going to build that in as well, and we're going to have to just pay for it. It'll be a bit more expensive, but I think people will be, it's not prohibitive. It's really not.
No, and I mean it is the other thing that it does, which is slightly going back to the oil price. That was a kind of thing I realised quite early on when I was driving a very early electric vehicle, and I was going, no one's had to go to war to protect the fuel that this vehicle is using, or have a row, or have a discussion at OPEC and someone's walked out in a huff. That my entire adult life, I've been sort of aware in the background that there's some rows going on, not necessarily even wars, but there's some disputes going on about oil, who owns it, where it's from. And when you read the history of the oil industry, I mean, what BP came out of, the British Iranian oil company, and the kind of, it's not pretty, it's not.
Well, that was Winston Churchill's decision to move from coal, which we had domestically, to oil, was predicated on us being, Great Britain, being able to project our might via the Royal Navy to ensure that we could always get hold of oil, which we didn't have. And it was a huge, I don't know if it was a gamble, but it was a calculated risk to say, we've always got to, there's no way of being dependent on oil and separating it from being dependent on maintaining access to certain parts of the world. Yeah. So, I think that we're going to have very difficult, just going to electric vehicles is not going to solve all of that overnight, not by any means. No. First of all, we're going to get a whole new load of dependencies. Maybe it'll be cables to North Africa, and it might be, it's kind of interesting looking at the need for interconnections in the context of Brexit. Yeah. We've got to make sure that we are on good enough terms to be able to not just to buy electricity, but also to sell our excess. That's how you do this thing cheaply, is do it on a big area. And by the way, the two most connected countries in Europe for energy and electricity are actually Switzerland and Norway, and now us. So clearly it can be done. Yeah, I'm not pessimistic at all, but we're going to swap maybe some oil geopolitics with some electricity geopolitics, and also rare earths and cobalt, and there'll be some other the lithium and just being dependent on, instead of oil from the Gulf, we're going to be dependent on manufacturing in Asia. So different dependencies. The other thing we're going to have to contend with, and I think you personally are responsible for this, and it's your, you have to come up with the solutions, Robert. I'm putting it on your shoulders. You've got a lot of oil producing states that are going to, that are not, their economies are going to have to be dramatically restructured. Yeah. If the oil price, I started off by saying I think Saudi Arabia has made a mistake. They're not going to get a consistent $80 oil price in the future. It might spike. It will probably spike up again when we recover from COVID, right? Yeah. But if the oil price is systematically $40 to $60 or maybe $30 to $50, because there's always this kind of thumb on the scales of we've got alternatives, we're pushing it down. Then you're going to find a lot of countries that are quite populous now. Saudi Arabia is more than 40 million people now. Wow. And you've got other countries that will have invested in their oil production on the expectation of a $60, an $80, $50 price, that may be very poor countries. We're going to have a lot, I don't want to say it, but we're going to have a lot of failed states or potentially failed states on the production side. So it's going to be a wild roller coaster. Yeah.
It is. I had a fascinating conversation with someone from Costa Rica a couple of years ago. With no oil, Costa Rica doesn't have any oil on its, and it's quite a stable democracy, and it's and they're very keen to transition to electric transportation. They're talking buses and deliveries and all that, as taxis as well as cars.
They're going 100% renewable, I believe.
100% renewable,
and they're on track to do that.
Yeah,
they have a lot of hydro there, just to be
yes, they do. An enormous amount of hydro.
It's not they're using hydro. It's cheating.
They've got their own waterfalls and rainforest. It's totally unfair. But I mean, a lot of the countries that surround them that do have oil, they're not politically stable. They're riddled with corruption and violence and and it's heartbreaking. You just think this is so. It's kind of, there's an element to it that's a curse, like the Niger Delta. Whenever people go to me, oh, it's awful. What's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo with children mining? Yes, it is. It's inexcusably dire. But if you just look at the history of the Niger Delta, brutal massacres, assassinations, corruption, pollution off the scale, absolutely off, just pumping waste out onto the field just because where are we going to put it? I don't know, put it over there where people live and grow stuff, really horrendous.
They call the economic problems. There was, I think it was Holland that was the first to notice. They call it the curse of I think it was gas, the Dutch disease, they call it. Because they found gas. And it enormously inflated the value of the currency, and drove other businesses. Other businesses were in trouble. And of course, the curse of oil is well known. And it is also a curse, not just an economic curse, where you could say, well, it's caused a problem in countries like Norway, fabulous governance, but the oil industry is so productive, it makes it very difficult to do some other industries there. But then you've got on top of that the governance issues of a moneyed elite that is just very happy to take the money. I think the best example is it's one of the Guineas. I don't know if it's Guinea,
right?
Guinea-Bissau. I'm not sure which one, but it's the one in Africa where, if you look at GDP per capita, it's fantastic. It's it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per capita. Right. The problem is it goes straight into the coffers of the ruling party and the government, and then they're out to who knows where, which part of either Switzerland or the former British tax haven network, and of course the people meanwhile are living on a few $100s a day a year. Their average earnings are in the low thousands, and you think, okay, so I want all that to be over, but it is not going to be pretty getting there. It's going to be a very, very ugly process. And of course, the other thing is, even if you have a downside, we could see all of the demand. Transportation is going electric, all of the short distance, heavy vehicles, light vehicles, buses, coastal ferries, coastal freighters, obviously cars, delivery trucks. I'm amazed delivery trucks have not gone, delivery vans have not, why haven't mayors already said, 2024, no more diesel deliveries, bad for air quality. So, but that's all coming down the tracks. Even longer distance, I think a lot of it can electrify, or it'll sort of go electric through hydrogen, because the hydrogen will come from electricity. So that's another way of it being electrical demand, but via hydrogen or ammonia or some other synthetic fuel will also be, via electricity. Petrochemicals will take a lot longer. You've got all this stuff around plastic and use of plastic. So it is possible that sector goes ex-growth a lot more quickly than a lot of oil companies and oil-producing countries think. Right. Because, if we really said, well, we're actually going to recycle more plastic, we're going to use less plastic, and we're going to not chuck it in the ocean, we're going to recycle it, and we're going to get more and more of it out of a biological ultimately, you can make all of the molecules that we need. If you've got infinite money, you could make them all out of. You'd use electrolysis. Take water, split it into hydrogen, and oxygen. Take CO2 out of the air. Now you've got carbon, you've got hydrogen, you've got oxygen. You're making all of those molecules if you want. Right. It's just a question of the costs. But if you take a 30 or 40 year view, my sense is that we will, all of the shocks will be to the upside for the climate and for innovation. Humans are really smart, and we are starting to put serious money into not just batteries, but also all of those kind of, all of that synthetic, organic chemistry. And I don't think we're going to see the back of oil in 20 or 30 years, or 30 or 40 years. But I think that if any oil company or country that says, well, you'll always need the plastic, so we'll just pivot and we'll be. I think they need to be very, very, very careful.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, that's I think one of the best arguments about electric vehicles is I'd much rather we saved up as much of the petrochemicals as we can now for future use to do with whatever we can do with it, except burn it in an efficient engines.
Definitely, and certainly the bigger molecules, more common. If you're talking about really simple stuff, you want to make methane. Well, you probably could. That'd be one of the first things to fall to. An electrolysis plus capturing carbon or whatever. If you want to make really complicated molecules, it's so much easier to start with black goop. And at some point, you could envisage just in a few, many decades or maybe in 100 years, like, oh my God, they just burnt it.
Yeah,
they burnt it.
This brilliant stuff. They burnt it.
Like the Taliban blowing up those statues.
Yeah.
They just what were they thinking? Thinking? But anyway, maybe who knows?
Yeah. But I mean, the other side of it, I suppose, is because there's an interesting aspect, and I always try and hold myself back a bit. But when you see, like, in fact, one of the people I've interviewed recently has done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa with microscopically cheap and small solar and battery systems for individuals in their houses. And so it's one solar panel on the roof, bit of wire, tiny little battery, often an old truck battery, lead acid, few LED lights. They've got light at night, which they've never had, and they're not burning kerosene. And mobile phone charging. Exactly. Very important.
Yeah.
But what that changes is well, this is what I want to ask, really. If we create a new energy system that in a sense is then reliant on a few massive multinational companies that supply us, I don't know how it works, supply us with solar panels and batteries in our houses, and they still control and own all that and everything, then it's still better because we're not burning stuff, but in a sense, the families in Africa that can't afford to have a diesel generator are in pretty much the same position, maybe. I don't know.
I think the difference is that if you look at solar, a solar panel, what is it made of? Well, it's made of sand.
Yeah.
Most of it is, the silicon is sand and the glass is sand, and the glass, frankly, probably get replaced by some kind of plastic. But if you can't do that, then you could you go back to sand.
Yeah.
So there's nothing. These things are commodities in the sense of one solar panel is pretty much like another. You might get a few more percent of efficiency. One might have a better warranty or whatever. But fundamentally, no, I think we're going to, I think the world, as long as we have access to global supply chains, there will always be many companies that can make solar panels pretty darn easily. Same as, I don't even know I've got a flat screen on my computer. Is it an LG or is it a Samsung or is it is it a Lenovo? Or who cares, And these things just become very standardized.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's ever going to be in that environment a pinch point in the same way as there is around. You yourself, you talked about that massive refinery.
Yeah, the investment to build that's huge.
A limited number of places where you can get cheap oil. It's getting harder and harder. It's producing more and more water. So the ratio, the amount of energy required, and the separation, and the having to deal with polluted, produced water and so on, is getting worse and worse and worse.
Right.
Then you've got these huge refineries, and I think replacing that with as you said, it's a resource that is 90% efficient in the using, that is basically sand. And of course, there's electronics, and there's and then the batteries have got some. The batteries are a lot. You've got some nasty chemicals there. But the thing is that, the battery recycling, we don't recycle lithium-ion batteries coming out of, pocket calculators and even phones. They're tiny little things, and they're very fiddly and annoying. You get a battery out of a car with massive amount of, of nickel or lithium or cobalt or whatever. You're recycling it, and they're already starting to do that. And I don't have any doubt. But I want to come back to the million-mile battery is a really interesting thing. You might find some of your viewers interested in what does that mean? Because what's happening with that is that if you go back just a few years, just 5 years, 7 years, and people thought, well, a lithium-ion battery would be good for 1,000 cycles. So, after 4 or 5 years, your early Leaf or your early model Tesla Roadster, the original, you're going to have to replace the battery, and who's going to pay for that? And, then you start worrying about whether the company's still going to be around and all those sorts of good things. Fast forward to now, and you're already, I'm sure you've talked to experts, and I'm sure you've done segments on the fact that actually you can do 250,000 miles and you're still keeping 90% plus of the battery performance.
Yeah.
And that's not a breakthrough. That's not because we went to some magical solid state, completely different chemistry. That is just a hard grind of scientists in the lab and then production engineers just getting a little bit better and a little bit better and tweaking this and tweaking that and using a graphene shield to stop the needles of lithium growing across and short circuiting, et cetera, et cetera. It's just I don't want to call it basic research, but it's meat and potatoes of good scientists and good production engineers and so on. And what we're now looking at is just the number of cycles going up to 10,000 cycles,
right?
Which
wow.
You can already do if the battery is well managed in a stationary battery.
Yeah,
10,000 cycles, 1,000,000 miles, and then you start saying, well, hang on a second, my car's not going to last 1,000,000 miles, right? The door's going to fall off. But you could make. So here are 3 things that you could do. You could either say, well, the battery lasts forever, but the car doesn't, so we'll recycle it. You could. Actually, 4 things. That's number 1, we'll recycle it. Probably pretty, you can do it. I'm not worried about it, but it may not be the smartest. Number 2, you could say, well, maybe we just start building 1,000,000-mile cars.
Yeah.
Maybe because we don't have to have them all, at the moment you try and have them all fall apart after about 10 years, 12, 15, maybe 15 years if it's not in a sort of salty road environment, and you try and get everything to fall apart at the same time. Fuel injectors and and the windscreen wipers go round, and the doors fall off, and the whole thing, and the gearbox goes, the engine goes, everything. You want it to go at once, the bearings, the whole lot. Maybe we just up the engineering, and cars become 1,000,000-mile vehicles, and it's just understood. We don't have a house that falls apart in 15 years. Why should we do that? But the other things you could do is you could do vehicle to grid, which I always thought, well, I understand smart charging, just saying, well, I'm going to charge at a time that's useful for the grid. But actually, if you've got 10,000 cycles, why wouldn't you do vehicle to grid when you've only got 1,000 cycles and your battery costs, $40,000? Well, that means that it's $40 per cycle. So if you can't earn $40 for selling the electricity, you won't do it.
Yeah.
Now, if you've got a battery that costs $10,000 and it's got 10,000 cycles, it's $1.
Right.
So as long as you can get more than $1 value out of selling your electricity instead of having a car sit there, you'll do it.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one, so that's number 3. The fourth one would be just second use batteries. You scrap a car, take the batteries out, and stick them in your eco luxury house in wherever, or you're on the grid, or you sell them to Nigeria, or you sell them to you sell them to somebody who just needs storage.
Yeah.
So I think that the implications of the 1,000,000-mile battery, the 10,000 cycle 1,000,000-mile battery, which doesn't need breakthroughs, it just needs this kind of grinding improvement for another few years. I don't think people have thought that through. That is a game changer.
Yeah.
Still won't get you through the beast from the east.
No.
It'll do almost everything else, but it won't do that.
Yeah. Because it is absolutely, that's the one. I've got a long running and very silly joke that I do on this show about the elephant in the room, because I've then worked out which is heating, particularly in our climate. But then for some stupid reason, I went off on some silly tangent where if you actually had an elephant in your room, it would heat it because they're very warm. They would produce a lot of heat. So I'm always pretending there's an elephant over there.
As long as some artist, Christopher Lee, hasn't stolen the dung to make an artwork from it, you could also burn the dung. Although we're trying to get away from that. It's very bad for air quality. Very bad for air quality, and it's a serious problem.
Whenever my neighbours are burning elephant dung, I'm always going, oh, why do they do that?
Yeah, well, you need to move around so you're upstream of them.
Michael, what I want to do is do this again, because we've done. I mean, I'm just trying to keep us to around an hour, and we've gone over an hour, which is great. It's brilliant. I'm really thrilled, because there's so many other questions I want to ask you, and I haven't. Yes, I think we've got to sort of wind it up. But I just want to thank you enormously for finding the time, finding the location, finding your headphones, making it all work. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. It's been brilliant talking to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for all you do, and it's been great fun. So anytime, and we can do a deep dive into any of these things. You can tell I just love this stuff. I love the fact that we're just making such transformational changes, and they are for the good. Which is like, well, you know, what's not to like?
Exactly. No, I'm with you 100%. Well, that's all we got time for. I really hope you enjoyed that. I know I did. He is an extraordinary man. And once we have, we're back on schedule and normally filming in normal real world, I'm definitely going to get Michael to come back on the show, because he really is an extraordinary man. Anyway, please do subscribe to this podcast. And if you watch YouTube on Fully Charged, we haven't quite taken over one of Google's major assets yet. You know, still time. Sorry, if you watch Fully Charged on YouTube, well, please do watch it if you don't, and please do subscribe there too, and have a look at the little Patreon link that is in the show notes for this episode. That's it. And as always, if you have been, thank you for watching.